Almost 30 years of work, so forgive me if there's quite a lot I'm showing you, but I thought it was important to sort of describe the arc of work that I've done over the years. So I was born in London, and when I was a child, when I was like 11 years old, my mother took me to the Natural History Museum, and the Natural History Museum had a young naturalists club. It's nothing to do with being naked. It's to do with taxidermy and all the things the museum's involved with. And I became quite interested in the art of taxidermy and preserving skins and bird wings and all those sorts of things. That comes into play later on, but bear that in mind. That's me as a miserable teenager. All my early interests were very much guided towards the Gothic, the fairy tale, the magical. I have no idea why we have those interests, but they're innate in certain individuals. Different people have different interests. Those were mine. I went to Wimbledon School of Art and did the theatre design course, which is a 3-year degree. And one of the part-time tutors was Derek Jarman, who was a remarkable man and filmmaker, visionary. I don't know whether you've seen many of his films, but if you haven't, you should do. These are images from The Tempest and some of his Super 8 films. He was a very experimental filmmaker, and he had a huge impact. When I left Wimbledon, I went on to become his sort of assistant, studio assistant. So I left college, and back then, you could squat. Now, all the youngsters, squatting now is virtually impossible, but back then, if you saw a nice building that had been empty for some years, you could kick the door in and occupy it, which is what we did. We occupied a building near Russell Square, bang in the middle of London. It was owned by Great Ormond Street Hospital, Children's Hospital, and it had been empty for nearly 15 years. And we wrote to them and said, we're occupying the building, we're a group of artists, can we have the power put back on? And the gas. And they were sort of, okay, that's fine. You can only stay for 7 years. 7 years. For us, that was like a lifetime, 7 years. So what that did, what that gave us as a group of individuals and a group of artists, who were signing on, basically, and doing odd jobs, was it allowed us to develop our work in a way that now is so much harder because we didn't have any overheads. We weren't paying any rent. We were bang in the middle of town. We could go clubbing when we wanted and walk home. And, oh, sorry, I should go back and explain what that was. That was somebody's bottom. So during my time at Wimbledon, we'd done a mask-making sort of project, and I'd used fish skin. And I went on to develop these sort of pieces of jewellery, really, and they were like body sculpture. And they were quite ornate. They were based on a lot of stories from sort of Victorian novelists and their sort of decadent movement. And they used taxidermy and animal parts. And I was on the tube one day wearing a claw in rush hour, and got hooked onto the back of this poor, unfortunate woman who stood in front of me. And as we were trying to get disengaged, she asked what the hell that was I had on my jacket. And she was the head buyer at Liberty's in the jewellery department. Well. And so they commissioned a set of jewellery. So all of a sudden, I was squatting, didn't have any money, but could start making a living from making the jewellery. So the jewellery developed over the course of sort of 3 or 4 years, and became far more complex than the original pieces. I learned sort of basic metalworking techniques and stone setting. This is a piece based on Oscar Wilde's story, The Nightingale and the Rose, which is a very, very sad story about a nightingale who overhears a poet bemoaning his fate that he hasn't got a rose to give to his beloved. And so she strikes up a bargain with the rosebush to press her breast to a thorn and sing throughout the night to create this perfect rose. Stop crying. And then in the morning when he gives it to his beloved, she's actually being bought out with jewels and precious stones and by somebody, another suitor. And so it's a very sort of bitter diatribe on love. And this piece was designed to cut you to ribbons if you actually wore it. It's made of cast rose branches in bronze with a dead nightingale in the center. So the pieces were becoming much more complex and story-based. These are some fish heads. The V&A saw one at the Crafts Council Gallery, and commissioned one for the collection, which is still in there. The pieces sometimes were quite elaborate. This was a cast of a human skull with ram's horns and ceramic beads and brass. So that led to some exhibitions, which in turn led to some magazines picking up the stories. This was the Craftsman performance at the Crafts Gallery. The pieces got bigger and more elaborate. This is the Memento Mori necklace with talons, bird talons, Victorian jet and rabbit skulls, all embroidered. And then there was this piece. Now, because of the publicity in the magazines and stuff, a gallery that was opening up in on the corner of Burlington Arcade and Cork Street, which was a new gallery looking at artist jewellery. And they were looking for someone a bit edgy who wanted to do some new work. And they basically gave me a retainer for 6 months to develop the work with proper jewellers, not me, who could set stones and all those sorts of things in grown-up ways. And it also gave me the opportunity to develop storytelling. And this particular piece is called the Incubus Necklace. And it's based on the story of the incubus and the succubus. Now, the incubus and the succubus were sort of medieval imps. The incubus would impregnate nuns, and the succubus would draw off the precious fluids of sleeping monks. And basically, it was an excuse for, a very hypocritical excuse for nuns becoming pregnant and monks having stained sheets, that sort of thing. So I love this story, the crossover between the pagan and the Christian. And this is a necklace filled with 5 phials of sperm, with little swimming sperms in silver, and Baroque pearls. And Baroque pearls were seen as a symbol of corruption, so they seem to go together very well. So 1986, the exhibition's due to open on Midsummer Night, and a friend of mine who Derek had introduced me to, called Tilda Swinton, who's an actress, you probably all know, kindly offered to open it. And I did a radio interview the day before on Kaleidoscope. And it was really early in the morning. I'll be up all night, finishing everything off, and I was knackered, basically. And I was yakking on about the pieces and talking about the Incubus necklace. Then went back to the studio the day before, worked all through the night. The next morning, the exhibition was due to open, the gallery rang me and was saying, are you on your own? I was like, no, there's all the students who are working with me to finish everything. The police are here. And the police had raided the gallery with a warrant for my arrest for outraging public decency. So, Scotland Yard got involved to confiscate a necklace. Nothing was happening in 1986 on Midsummer's Night, obviously, so it ended up getting quite a lot of publicity. 1987, sorry, I can't even get my dates right. But what it meant was the exhibition sold out, obviously, and led to quite a lot of publicity, not all of it good. However, a young student who was at Central St Martin's, finishing his degree, wrote to me and said, could I borrow some of your jewellery for my degree show? I said, yeah, of course you can. I'm always happy to help students. I was one. And his name was Alexander McQueen. And the reason why he's got gaffer tape all over his head is because he was signing on and getting benefits and also appearing in magazines. So whenever you see early pictures of Lee, he's got his face covered. So this took me in another direction, basically. I started to work with Lee as his set designer, basically. And I really wanted to, I nagged him, basically, to let me do some sets for him because He didn't have very much money at the beginning, and we were all given the opportunity to sort of experiment and play, which was really important. This was the sort of core group that worked around and with Lee at the time. Lots of these people are still working with Lee. That's Sam Gainsbury on the far side, and John Gosling. Trino, she's still there. And Sean Lean, the jeweller, he's still working with the McQueen house. So we started working together, and what I was able to do, because I was still making artwork, was to introduce Lee to sort of different artists and designers. And I had an exhibition in Milan of some sculptures I was doing at the time, and I met this fantastic photographer called Joel Peter Witkin, which is this chap. Joel Peter Witkin, in case you don't know, makes very, very dark imagery. That's one of the pieces. They're quite extreme, they're quite provocative. And I bought Lee the catalogue, which of course he loved, because he was very extreme and quite provocative. And this was the influence for that mask, which later appeared in the Dante show. So it was things like that. There was a lot of cross-pollination of ideas going on between all of the people working with Lee at the time. There's lots of shows I could show you, but I did show you this particular one, which was originally entitled Golden Showers. But due to Amex being the sponsor, they took umbrage with that when they found out what it meant. And it was retitled Untitled. So the premise was for Lee just said the first half of the collection is black and he wanted a white catwalk. Second half was white and he wanted a black catwalk. So it's how to make that in 3 dimensions. So I had the idea of doing a catwalk that filled with water as you came in. It was all underlit with hundreds and hundreds of fluorescent tubes. I think there's one, here we go. So you can see how hundreds of tubes. And we worked with ICI to produce these plexi tanks which filled with water as the audience came in. And then halfway through the show, the models exited, and we filled the tanks with black ink to the Jaws music, which I thought was a bit tacky, but Lee liked it. So it all went black. And then there was like a sprinkler system, if you like, running across the top of the catwalk. And as the first model came on for the second half of the show, it rained throughout the second half. Again, really difficult thing to test, because we couldn't test it before the audience came in, because it would have given the game away. They would have seen all the rain. So we had to hope and pray that it worked. And luckily it did. Lee then got the position at Givenchy, and we all moved to Paris. He was under an enormous amount of pressure by then, because he's doing the couture shows, the ready-to-wear, his own line. And it was amazing how he kept it all going. He was still getting me to make pieces of jewellery. This is Jodie Kidd wearing a piece. I still went on developing the storytelling side of fashion shows. And for the Eclect Dissect show, produced all these collages, which looked at this sort of blending of autopsy and couture, and used books like The Island of Dr. Moreau as a reference. So there we go. Meanwhile, I'm setting myself on fire. When I was young, I loved special effects. And I don't know whether anyone's seen Harold and Maude. That was my childhood, basically. So by this time, there was a lot of photographers working with Lee, one of whom was called Nick Knight. And we went on to become friends and collaborators. And this was a project for the ICA in London, which produced this set of images. Obviously, that's not me in the end picture. But it's a collaboration that's continued. I'm still working with Nick to this day. Oh, Nick got on the front of Creative Review. Terrible picture. That's the only copy I've got of that magazine. Sorry about that. So by 1999, 98, I decided to sort of part company with Lee. There was lots of other projects I wanted to do, and working on the shows continually, that was the only thing I could do. So after a lot of heartache, we decided to part company. And I was approached by CLM, Camilla Lowther Management, who are mainly photographic agents, but they also represent makeup people and set designers. So I joined them as a set designer. I'm still with CLM. But this opened up a whole world of opportunities to work with different people. This was a collaborative project with Vogue, where we scoured the archives of Vogue, of all the shoots, like David Bailey's first ever shoot that was commissioned by Vogue and then not used because they thought it was rubbish. And Helmut Newton shoots that were slightly too risky for the time. But we were able to put all these transparencies and work on these as Cecil Beatons at the top. And it was an amazing project, seeing all this work that has been completely unseen by the public. Started working with other designers as a Roberto Cavalli show. Roberto Cavalli, he's as deaf as a post, bless him. Deaf as a post. And the only thing, sadly, with this show was because the auditorium was so vast, he kept cranking the sound up. And sadly, the only thing the papers wrote about the next day was how deafening the noise was, but they forgot the set. Around 2001, actually it was 2000, the first project, I started working with Hermès in New York. And Hermès are a fantastically visionary company. They're sort of the only luxury brand left, really, proper luxury brand. And they're one of those dream clients. They're incredibly literate, visually literate. You can go to them with any kind of reference and they understand exactly what you're talking about. Most of my time working with clients is a process of not re-educating, that's patronized, but it's sort of, they're not quite as literate, as visually literate as they could be. Hermès are fantastic. This was a party where I based it on the Fluxus art movement that happened. It's a very short art movement, happened in the 70s in New York. Yoko Ono was a member of the Fluxus art movement, and they were very anti-gallery. They'd do things like send out artworks over a course of a week, and you had to go to a street corner and pin them up, and that would create the work. So this whole party began with life drawing classes. We had a sort of punk moment with a cellist playing the cello, who then slowly destroyed his cello with a set of beautiful Hermès pliers and saws and instruments, things like that. This was another party, the Tribeca Ball. Using my squatting days, we occupied this old bank building, and everything in it was made out of, not rubbish, but you know, the chairs had paper bags with a Chippendale chair printed on the back. Everything was made out of the bars were made out of the cardboard boxes. It was all, I worked with Baz Luhrmann at the time he was doing La Boheme on Broadway. There's some actress, I can't remember her name. And all the curtaining was made out of shipping plastic, red shipping plastic, things like that. So, got to do their windows for Christmas, and this was, the premise for these was that you were either a good girl or a bad girl, and if you were a good girl, you got the Birkin bag, and this was the machine that spied on you throughout the year to decide whether you'd been good or bad. And that's it being made, and everything whirled around and clanked, and yes, it either worked or it didn't. You failed or you passed. Matthew Williamson, did quite a lot of work with him. This was working with Gainsborough and Whiting again, who are Lee's producers. These are giant balloons that they use on location in films when they haven't got any. They put one of these balloons up with a massive light in, so we use these to represent planets. Now, about 15, 16 years ago, a young photographer was represented by CLM called Tim Walker. He'd recently been working as Richard Avedon's assistant in New York. He came back to London and wanted to set up as on his own, with his own name. This was his first ever shoot for Italian Vogue. We didn't have any money at all to do this. And it was all a kind of Alice through the looking glass, with sheets of plexi with holes cut in, basically, to make it look as if the model was passing through the mirror. I painted up the background and a bit of carpet, and so it was all put together very, very cheaply. Tim now, of course, is massive. This was a shoot we did where I took his first ever camera, his first ever Pentax, and built it like 20 times the size it should be. That's just the lens of it, with a giant copy of Vogue. The actual camera, you can see there. So it's all made in wood and plaster and scrim and all the rest of it. But everything you see with Tim's pictures is what's in front of the camera. He doesn't really use any Photoshop whatsoever. And in many ways, it was the first time anyone had done that. Cecil Beaton had made quite elaborate sets, but Tim took it to a whole sort of new level, or takes it to a whole new level. What do you notice about that greenhouse? Anything? Yeah. Every single piece in that greenhouse was made so all the little pots, all the ferns we had to source from, what are those rockeries called? Rockeries with small ferns in. That. It's that kind of thing. Every single detail was replicated to scale. So that greenhouse is about this big. And that's one of the wonderful things Tim does with his work. He plays with sense of scale, fairy stories, storytelling. Lots of people thought we'd actually built the room set around the tree, but the tree was built in the room. So the tree was all made in polystyrene and then textured, and we painted it and stuck moss on it and made it look as, and there's actually a bar running across the top that's all cable tied onto. Hermès again. This was a collaborative project between Tim and I and Hermès, and I wrote a story about a sort of evil Maharaja who'd cast a spell on this house, and everyone had fallen asleep. It's very Snow White, no, not Snow White. What is it? But they all fall asleep in the house. Sleeping Beauty, that's the one. Only it was an Indian version, and we had horses painted pink, and all the guests had to visit these Indian gods and goddesses around the grounds of the house, and the strength of the charms they picked up would break the spell. That's when the party started. That was a shoot I did with Tim that's on the front of his book, with Humpty Dumpty and Kylie Kloss. Humpty now lives with me. Doesn't say much. I've got the solid version and not the broken one, but he's sitting in the living room. That's the other thing with Tim's props. It's heartbreaking when you can't throw them away. So he has a huge storage space where everything's there. And anyone who came to the, did you see who went to see Tim's exhibition at Somerset House? Yeah, knew somebody. So he keeps the props and then uses them for exhibitions and things. This was a shoot we did just before Christmas for W magazine. We shot 40 celebrities in 2 weeks in Los Angeles and then New York. Tim Spore, Julian Moore. And so it's very, very rapid. And she's adorable, by the way, Julian Moore. If you haven't, she's lovely, so lovely. And so is Timothy Spore barking. That's another thing. Eddie Redmayne. So again, working with Tim, we're working on a project at the moment. This you wouldn't necessarily know was a Tim Walker shoot, but he did the advertising campaign for Katy Perry's perfume in it, and then we did the film afterwards. This set was all built in Los Angeles. Paolo Reversi, I've just chosen one shoot I've done with him. I've done many over the years, but this is sort of an example of the lo-fi. It doesn't always have to cost a fortune, these things. This is an overhead projector. You know those overhead projectors that they use in college? Where you put things on the glass and it projects them. Well, this I just sat with a pair of scissors and cut out things like the bird in this instance. And then she had to stand very, very still because it's on a long exposure, because it was the only source of light. But it's fantastic what you can do with just an overhead projector and some cardboard and a pair of scissors. So, and a very, very good model, obviously. Another Nick Knight picture, Kylie, love Kylie. She's only this big. And that is a real glass. But we actually shot the bowl was fabricated by a Perspex company, and then he comped in the stem. Gareth Pugh. Now, Gareth's a good example of working with a designer with very little money for set, and which really pushes how you approach a catwalk show. I think I had £60 to do this catwalk. So I bought some weather balloons on eBay, which they send up things, I don't know what they weather things, and gave the model a pin. So the first model who came on actually walks behind that balloon and stuck the pin in, and it was filled with talcum powder, and it just went everywhere. Looked great, nice punchy moment to open the show. This was done with strips of packing tape and a wind machine, so the models walked through that sort of curtain. This was something I'd always wanted to do, but nobody ever let me do it because of it being quite dangerous. It's an inflatable catwalk. And the idea was that the models had to, there's a walk that models do called pony stepping, which is this very high walk. And we taught them to do that with this catwalk, which was actually a huge piece of silk with wind machines down one end, and it just inflated, basically. And the models had to navigate it, not being able to see a lot either. But nobody fell over, and it all looked rather fabulous. And that was £150, that one. I was really pushing the boat out, that was. Gareth was one of the sort of pioneers of fashion film. He started working with a brilliant young fashion filmmaker called Ruth Hogben, who'd been previously Nick Knight's assistant. And Google Ruth Hogben, because she's amazing. And this was a show that was in New York, and it's all based on the sort of fire, earth, wind, air principles. And this was a throne that was supposed to have all this neon on and all that sort of thing, but we didn't have enough money. So all I've done is cut grooves in the MDF and then backlit it when it had that frosting gel stuff across the back that's used in lighting. And then we projected it onto a giant cube, massive, in a warehouse in New York. And you walked around and saw the show that way. I wanted to put this in because the briefs you get from some designers are quite scant sometimes. And this was a designer, he said, we want a show about nothing. Okay, so nothing, just sort of nothingness. So I had to sort of go away and think about a show about nothing. And so it was Valentino, by the way, and they're lovely, don't get me wrong, they're gorgeous designers. So I came up with this sort of idea of smoke and mirrors and projections that were there 1 minute and then not, and things like birds who were there 1 minute and not. And so what we did was, in the venue, we had these electronic pieces of gauze, really, that you could project on. So they came up and down on, so the things appeared and disappeared as the show progressed. So that's how I interpreted that brief. Pretty tough one to do, I can tell you. Here we go. This was in Paris a few years ago. Now this project, I need a drink for this. Imagine being asked to work on a project inside the Grand Palais, which is like Crystal Palace, but French. And it's to recreate an area of Paris in a kind of fantasy world. It was for H&M and Sonia Rykiel, and they were launching some lingerie. And they decided to do a very, 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 very big party one evening. And so I worked with a whole team from Belgium to come up with how we could actually build and recreate Paris 1/3 the size. And so this is the model we all put together, we made, scale model. This was how they tackled the Eiffel Tower, which was, because it was so expensive to construct physically, we actually decided to do it with a metalwork frame that's just dressed in hundreds of lights. I don't know whether you've seen the Eiffel Tower. Every hour it starts to twinkle even. So we took that as a starting point. Looked gorgeous. Actually worked really well. There we are. So this project was 6 months, more or less, from start to finish. That's the Arc de Triomphe in the Sonia Rykiel colours that split at the beginning of the party. You'll see why in a minute. All the shops, I used, there you go, splitting fireworks. Some books from the 1950s, children's illustrations, French mid-century children's illustrations are exquisite. And a very good source for this, because Sonia Rykiel has that kind of aesthetic. So it worked quite well. And the guests, there were 2,000 guests. They could wander the streets. There was shops set up where they could buy the collection. You could guzzle as much champagne as you wanted, oysters. The show opened with a flock of geese, because Sonia Rykiel is vegetarian and doesn't like foie gras. You know, where the geese are force-fed and their livers, anyway. So it's very strange. I designed all the floats that the actual collection was shown on. And at the time, I was working in Belgium. My rendering chap was in Scotland. And so what I'd do would make a little cardboard model, put the notes on, send it to him. He would send it back, and so this dialogue would go on. It's only because of computers that we can do this. And then it developed into this sort of, this is just one of them, I'll show you the rest. It's a giant sort of magazine. And that's how it manifested when it was put together. Others were this whole swing section. It was all, these are all motorized, by the way. They're all being driven by, see him, he's on something that's used to transport, because you can't have petrol in the Grand Palais. You have to, it all has to be electric. And they're used to transport things in warehouses, that very, very heavy loads, and they're battery powered. And the production company found them. They're brilliant. We just made them all black. This head was sculpted in polystyrene. The chandelier was something we actually found that had been used for theatre production, and then we rejigged it. So it was strong enough for the models to actually sit on. So that was that. And that cost a lot of money, that party. That was like a £5 million project to launch lingerie. Luckily, it sold well, so they were all fine. Another example of doing something at the total opposite end of the scale that's very, very cheap. I love cardboard. I've always loved cardboard. This was done for a project in Italy for a furniture company called Dead On. It's just something in the entrance that I wanted to put together, but it led to a commission by the Museum of London to recreate the lost buildings of London for their Dickens exhibition. So this, we worked for about 4 months putting together a cardboard version of London. That's sort of how it looked when it's put together. Another aspect of what I do is lots of private parties. This was a chap who wanted a surprise party for his fiancée, who was obsessed with fairy tales, so he found me, thank goodness. And when the guests arrived, they were greeted by this giant book, and the performer here opened the page, and there was a tunnel through which everyone entered into this sort of forest of tables. Everyone was weeping, it was so lovely. And it was like this, and the lights were changing, and it was gorgeous, and the food was all delicious. And I worked with a skate, what do you call them? Those graffiti artist who was on a skateboard, and he hit the wall in the South Bank, and I was helping him up and asking what he did. And he very, very kindly offered to do these creatures that were in that forest that you saw. That's random fact, but I'll throw that in. This is quite funny, really. This is a project in Moscow for a new department store that was built on top of a beautiful old Victorian flower market. And they said, would you come over and do something in our atrium, which was like 7-story atrium. So I thought, wouldn't it be nice if the flowers had reclaimed the space? So I designed these 17-meter tall orchids. But how do you make a 17-meter tall orchid? So we worked with the set builders for the Bolshoi Ballet, who were fantastic. And they came up with this kind of aluminium armature over which was stretched like lycra, really, that was then painted and sprayed. There's a little film online, you can actually see how it was all constructed. But that's the orchids. Terrified small children for some reason. No idea why. I suppose it's a Triffid thing. Could be. There's a lot of projects I could show you for Faberge, but Faberge, again, little like Hermès, very, very visionary, very literate, and they took over the whole of Harrods last year for Easter to do a kind of Faberge at Harrods thing. So what they didn't tell me, though, was that I only had 2 weeks to design 27 windows for them. So a lot of red wine and late nights later, came up with the, by the way, that's Carl Faberge, bless him. The first ever egg he did for the royal family was a small white enamel egg with a chicken, a golden chicken inside it. So that's Carl popping out of the egg in a little Monty Python moment. And I didn't think they'd actually go for it, but Faberge are very secure in who they are and their identity, so they were quite happy for me to play around with their image. Lots of companies don't like you dissing the creator and sticking a chicken on his head, but Faberge were fine. The idea was that Carl had nodded off a few days before the October Revolution, and what you're seeing played out in the windows was like a sort of stream of consciousness. These were all his maquettes of how he may have created the eggs, because we don't know. But it's just how I imagined he could have done it. So they were works in progress. It was about process. The windows were all about process. These were all his sort of illustrious clients popping out of books. So we worked with scenic artists from the Royal Opera House. Luca, who's brilliant. Wanted to also look back at the history of decorated eggs, because you know me in folklore. So we had these Russian eggs painted for us and shipped over, hundreds of them. That's a sort of imaginary view of Carl Faberge's studio office. One of the maquettes, this particular egg opened up and there's this beautiful golden carriage inside it. But this was actually all made out of coat hangers, sort of like a working model. The idea it was like a working model. Worked with a brilliant team of girls who created this paper ballerina, which was, the necklace she's wearing was one of the famous necklaces, the name of which I completely, the Romanov necklace, I can't remember it, where she's wearing that in that picture. The little small vitrine windows had laser-cut brass things and golden trees. He liked a serpent, Faberge. Snakes were on lots of things he did, cigarette cases and pieces of jewellery. So we got this company to replicate this gigantic golden serpent. Again, working with scenic designers, scenic artists, because there wasn't much time to actually get all of this done. So it was like, thanks. I had a month to actually get everything constructed. So painting something flat, two-dimensional, was obviously took a lot less time than having something three-dimensional made. We did manage to get Humpty back in, though. There he is, some golden eggs. These were sort of mock-ups, maquettes for his beautiful cigarette cases he made. This was all made out of paper, again, like my cardboard, and sketches of one of the eggs behind. This is funny. This was last year. Oh no, it wasn't. It was this year. It's this year. Hermès again. Each year, Hermès have a theme for the year. Like the Indian theme was the one with the horses and the pink thing. This year was the flaneur, and the flaneur is a sort of 19th century term for a sort of wealthy individual who doesn't have to work and can wander the streets, basically, and observe things. That's a flaneur. So Hermès wanted to recreate a flannery where the journalists could actually visit an area of London and do a flaneur, become flaneurs. And they chose 7 people. There was writers and journalists, and I got to do an area, and I chose Bloomsbury, but looking at the occult side of Bloomsbury. There's the oldest occult bookshop, the Atlantis. There's John Dee's scrying mirror in the British Museum. Do you know what a scrying mirror is? Is any pagans in the audience? Damn. It's a black mirror that's used to, it's a form of divination. You gaze into the mirror just beyond the surface and you ask it questions. But John Dee was Queen Elizabeth I's occult astrologer, and it's in the British Museum. So, as well as designing one of the flaneurs, they asked me to do the party, which was at the Saatchi Gallery. So I thought it'd be nice to recreate a street, basically, a road that ran through the Saatchi Gallery and became a table where all the food and wine and things could be served. So we had lots of hired lampposts. And I got to dress up as Aleister Crowley. Now, Aleister Crowley was once, stop laughing, was once termed the evilest man in the world, the Beast 666. And so I got to walk the streets with my banner. In the 70s, there was a very well-known man, you wouldn't know him from Adam, who was in London at the time, very eccentric, who walked the streets with this banner saying less protein, less passion. He was sort of an eccentric man who, the banner ended up in the Museum of London, actually. But he was just known. He was a figure in the 70s. So I decided to recreate his banner, but do it as Aleister Crowley would have done. And there's me chatting with some born again. Oh, no, they weren't born. They were, what's that Wake magazine? What are they called? Jehovah's Witnesses. Asking me what the hell I was doing. I was trying to tell them who Aleister Crowley was, but it fell on deaf ears, as you can imagine. Now, as part of the flaneur, one of my favourite books as a teenager was Against Nature. I don't know if anyone's read it, but it was like the Bible of the decadent movement. For the Oscar Wilde wrote it into The Portrait of Dorian Gray. It was meant to be this corrupting novel written in the 19th century. And part of the book describes an all-black dinner party where all the food was black to mourn the temporary loss of the hero of the book's virility. And Hermès had got to hear about an event I did at the V&A where I recreated this black dinner. And I arrived down Old Brompton Street in a hearse. That's me in the back. And there's always 13 guests. I do this dinner party every 2 years, I should point out. So this was the V&A offer to host it. And I said, yes, great. There were some various scary characters. That's Michael Howes. We arrived, we processed through the V&A and ended up in the canteen, beautiful canteen at the V&A, where we had this processional sort of dinner where the food was brought on. It was all part of the procession. That's the whole scary crew. There's the Elephant Man there and various other characters. Anyway, Hermès got to hear about this. That's us all eating with Tim Walker's skeleton sitting at the end of the room. And we recreated that for the flaneur. So the guests, the journalists, got to have a dine with death experience. Worked with this fantastic catering company called the Cellar Society, who do very, very sort of top-end catering. Catering doesn't even begin to describe what they do. They're incredibly visionary. So we had mourners handing out the food and the drink. Everything was black. We had funeral dirges playing. It was really cheery. Yeah, they enjoyed it. But that's how that set looked. That should have gone earlier, but that's the set with the lampposts. We had lots of performers. There were drunken waiters who fell asleep and dropped the food on the floor. We had tea ladies, char ladies, smoking, street art, pavement artists, the town crier. It's all those sorts of characters. I'm jumping around everywhere. Is this all right? Yes, right, isn't it? It's fine. This is a project with the National Trust. And the National Trust in Fountains Abbey. Has anyone been to Fountains Abbey? Fantastic. That's beautiful, Fountains Abbey. In the grounds of the Abbey, there are these follies. And they commissioned three different artists to produce an installation inside one of them. We could choose which one we wanted. And this is the Temple of Hercules. Now, the Temple of Hercules, when it was built, I always get his name wrong. Aisleby? Azel, that will do. That's it. He was a very wealthy man, built these temples, as was the way in those days, to make these incredible ornamental gardens. And he was a crook, basically, and went to the Tower of London for embezzling money. And his son, to make amends, renamed the Temple of Hercules, which is the pagan god, the Temple of Piety. So I wanted to take it back to the pagan things, and this became a shrine to a series of pagan gods and goddesses. You've got Diana the Huntress, Neptune, Flora the goddess, Faunus, who's like Pan. This is actually on show at the moment, so if ever you find yourself in Fountains Abbey, you can. The Museum of British Folklore. So alongside my commercial work is this project that is very, very, very dear to my heart. I've always loved folklore, and by folklore I mean the sort of seasonal events and customs we have in the UK, like bonfire night and May Day festivals, and things like the Abbots Bromley Horn Dance. Has anyone ever seen that in Staffordshire? Abbots Bromley Horn Dance, one of our oldest seasonal customs, happens in August, and the antlers here, a while ago, it was actually probably 10, 15 years ago, they chipped, and it was carbon dated to 1065 or thereabouts. So it's very, very old, but they're actually reindeer antlers, which aren't native to this country, so we don't know how they came into the UK. There's 6 performers, along with Maid Marian and various other characters that process. And it's a processional dance. 3 of the antlers are very light, the other 3 are very dark. So it's it's open to interpretation. We don't know why it started or how it started, but it's very beautiful. I love this picture. This is photographs by Doc Rowe, who's actually talking tomorrow, I think. He's doing some things with the Folk Festival. Doc's a big supporter of the museum project. And this is the Bury Man from South Queensferry. He's wearing a bodysuit covered in sticky burrs, you know, those things that stick to your legs when you're in the grass, that sort of thing. And I love her, like, oh, yeah, whatever. And this extraordinary character that's like something out of a nightmare. And he processes through the streets in South Queensferry. He can't put his arms down because, like Velcro, he would just stick. So he has to keep his arms apart with these sticks. Again, no one has a clue really why this started, but it's like most folkloric seasonal customs, it's very, very particular to the area, to South Queensferry. And people bring him whiskey and touch him or kiss him, and it's like a sort of good luck character. The Hunting of the Earl of Roane. This was a reinvention, but the Earl of Roane, they think, was the Earl of Tyrone, who was like a sort of brigand, smuggler and all the rest of it. And he's led backwards through the town on a donkey. Of course he is. And he's shot regularly, which is why he's in such a padded suit, because he falls off the donkey several times a day, gets back on. And then he's ritually slaughtered at the end of the day, where there's a fake version of him, gets thrown into the sea and stoned to death. Nice. Padstow May Day. Padstow May Day is incredible. Padstow's in Cornwall, Again, one of our oldest traditions. This is an obios, the os. It's a sort of representation of a horse, but it's a lot more than that. The whole community is, it's the thing that binds Padstow together, the people that live in Padstow. There are 2 osses, but there have been in the past 6, 7, sometimes they're white. This is the current os. This is another Dock Row photograph. And again, it's a processional event. Starts off in the night before, and then these things career around the streets and eventually meet together in the town centre, the town square. Ottery St Mary barrel burning. This is coming up. This is November the 5th. No idea why this happens, but it starts off with children from the ages of 11 to 15 running with a burning barrel on their backs. They would be, under any other circumstances, raced to A&E, not in Ottery St Mary. Next, the women have their turn running through the streets, and then the men have their turn, and the barrels increase incrementally as they go on. Again, nobody really knows the origins of it. It's very particular to Ottery, which is in Devon. So I thought, why haven't we got a museum of folklore? We've got so much of it in this country. And it was really frustrating for me not having somewhere to go where I could learn about more of this stuff. So it's been my mission to establish the first ever Museum of Folklore. In 2009, I went out on the road in my painted caravan, which I bought on eBay for £279. I was the only bidder, but it's fine. And inside it was gutted and filled with cabinets. I got Stephen Jones, who's a friend who's a milliner, to create a museum in a hat. Gareth Pugh made all the outfits for the tour. And then, bless their hearts, Helena Bonham Carter and Tim Burton came and opened the event in London. I didn't ask them, they just turned up, which was quite bizarre, really. Maurice Thames danced that night, the Unthanked played, and I spent 6 months on the road touring the whole of the UK, from Scotland to Cornwall, Devon, Dorset, Shropshire, etc. So I will whistle through the last piece of this. With me was Henry Bourne, who's recording a lot of the customs and people. And we've just launched Arcadia Britannica, which is now out with Thames and Hudson. There's a book of over 300 of the portraits that we took. We had several exhibitions on the history of fireworks, this one. Within the museum's collection, we've got the largest collection of fireworks in the UK. Folklore and photography, which was at the Towner. The Whitechapel, we put on the British Popular Art, looking at Barbara Jones's show from 1951. And that's the design for the museum, as it stands at the moment. It's a cluster of buildings allied to the cardinal points. So you come in, you navigate whichever way you want, but it's laid out from spring, summer, autumn, winter. And we're currently in the fundraising part. So if you know anyone who's got 20 million, that's how much we need. I think that's it. That's where I am at the moment. So yeah, thank you.
Simon, thank you. We have got a short while left for any questions that anyone might have for Simon. I'm kind of so blown away.